Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 6th edition of the UCD Alumni Relations webinar series, UCD in Conversation. My name is Jenna Bjorkman, and I'm the Alumni Relations Officer for the UCD College of Engineering and Architecture. And we are thrilled to welcome our UCD alumni community from around the world to listen as fellow alumni and UCD academics share their stories and ideas. This series also reflects UCD's new strategy entitled Rising to the Future and its 4 strategic themes which focus on UCD's contribution to global challenges. These are creating a sustainable global society, transforming through digital technology, building a healthy world, and empowering humanity. As many of you will know, UCD is at the forefront of efforts in fighting COVID-19, and we are committed to supporting our students through this difficult time. To date, over €200,000 has been raised by generous alumni and friends of UCD. Thank you to those of you who have already supported this important cause. If you would like to support our efforts to provide urgent financial and mental health support to those students who need it most, you can visit the link which has been posted to the chat box in your own time. The format for this evening includes a 30-minute conversation followed by a Q&A session, and we will plan to wrap up by 7:45 or 8 p.m. Please feel free to submit questions throughout using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Your questions will help us to connect and make this format more personal, so please do submit them. Orla will get to as many as she can at the end of the conversation, but please note that she may not have time to address every question. If for whatever reason you have to leave the conversation early or have a problem with connectivity, don't worry, we are recording this session and it will be made available on the UCD Alumni YouTube channel very soon. And so now, without further ado, I will hand over to Professor Orla Feely, Vice President for Research, Innovation and Impact, and Professor of Electronic Engineering at University College Dublin, who is joined in conversation with Sir Ciarán, Devane, Chairman of the Health Service Executive, Chief Executive of the British Council, alumnus of UCD Engineering, and friend of UCD. They have very graciously joined us today to discuss leadership in a time of crisis. Over to you, Orla.
And thank you, Jenna. So I'm delighted to be here today and to welcome you all to this conversation with Sir Ciarán Devane. Ciarán, like myself, is a UCD engineering graduate from the great days, Ciarán, of UCD in Merrion Street, which is now, of course, government buildings in Ireland. He was gone on to have a very illustrious and varied career. After working in the chemical engineering industry and in management consultancy, he became CEO of Macmillan Cancer Support. He transformed that organisation, turned it into the most trusted NGO in the UK, and in the process was knighted for his services to cancer patients. He's now CEO of the British Council, the UK's international organisation for cultural relations and international education. And he's also, as Jenna indicated, chair of the HSE, having also been on the board of NHS England. So Ciarán has a huge amount to tell us about leadership in crisis. In the British Council, he's dealt with war, terrorism, plague, natural disasters, famine, crises of all kinds. And of course, as chair of the HSE, he's overseeing the organisation that is at the front line of our national response to the pandemic. So Ciarán, thank you so much for joining us this evening. You're a very busy man at this time. Can you take us first of all back to Merrion Street and the career trajectory that brought you through these apparently disparate organisations to the point where you are now?
Thanks, Orla. Well, it's accident, really. I did what you'd expect a chemical engineering graduate to do, and at that time there were really 2 trajectories. One was to join one of the outposts of typically an American company in Cork, and the other one was to go to the chemical industry in another country, whether it be Germany or in my case in the UK. So I spent a long time working in the chemical industry in the northeast of England. And then, like many engineers do, went into management consulting, working in the pharmaceutical industry, agrochemicals industry, doing some work in aerospace. And then, for personal reasons, my wife died of cancer, as it happens. I decided to do something different. So I wandered off to the US, did a master's, really in part to get away from it all, but also to take the chance to do a topic which I knew nothing about, which happened to be international relations, which I was always fascinated by. Did that, came back, and of course I needed a job. The So the plan was to go back into management consulting or something, but it's just turned out that Macmillan was looking for a chief executive, and for the wrong reasons. Maybe I was the right person to do that role. And being, having the kind of, the business background and the industry background and the engineering background, I think is helpful in, most organizations, he says, as the engineer, in that you do have this kind of system thinking. You think about the relationship between systems and people, which is particularly important in, high hazard industries like the chemical industry, and you can bring those skills to, to what you do. And from Macmillan, of course, it wasn't a big step to then go on the board of the NHS in England, really as that kind of person coming from a patient point of view. The British Council was probably in some ways the bigger leap, because it's what we call, in Ireland, a semi-state. You're kind of the government, but you're not the government. And the role really is partly around, promoting education, promoting, the arts, but it's really about making friends, because if you go back to the origins of the organization, at a time of deep crisis, which was the Second World War, we got our, charitable objects in 1940, so, quite literally during the Blitz, as they would say. And the idea was to foster the interchange of knowledge, ideas, and discoveries. And the reason you do that is to create a basis of friendly knowledge and understanding between people. So with this idea of, if people engage, if they talk to each other, if they collaborate together, then good things are more likely to happen. Misunderstandings at a political level or an international level are less likely to happen. So it's exactly what we know, from our own experience on the island of Ireland, where people understand each other and share and are not living in separate communities. Then, peace is possible. Where people don't mix, don't connect, then misunderstanding is very easy, and relationships between different communities are that bit much more difficult. So it was a long accidental journey, but I would say really relying on, maybe if I think of one thing, some of those engineering skills, it's about systems, it's not just about things, it's about how things interact with each other. And one of those big things is, of course, how humans interact with each other. And if you look at many of those crises that you described that we deal with as the British Council, they're human. It's not because the IT system went wrong somewhere that the war broke out. It's because of human relationships. And I think one of the big things in managing or anticipating any crisis is thinking through the human aspects.
And that takes us now to the current crisis, which of course is human at its core. So tell me, what do you find to be some of the key leadership attributes needed to navigate one's way through a crisis of any hue, I suppose, but particularly a crisis like the one we're currently going through?
Well, I think if I think about how the pandemic hit the British Council, which is the organisation I'm chief exec of, we saw it early, because we have a big team. We have several hundred people working in China. So we saw what was happening. Our programs shut down. Our staff were told to go home, and we saw the impact that this was happening. So above all, the first response was it was a public health crisis. Let's look after our staff. Because that's what we should do as a good employer. So I think the first attribute then is, to be an employer who genuinely cares about your staff. So if you're going to handle it well, you have to know that part of what you're going to do is look after your staff. And you can see some organizations who maybe have been less agile in doing that, or less committed to doing that, who have additional difficulties because of that. But the other thing, of course, is it's a financial crisis. The business side of our operation shut down in China. Unsurprisingly, China is our biggest partner. We invigilate a lot of exams, millions of exams in China, and when that shuts down, suddenly you have a cash problem. So we realized very quickly that not only did we have a public health crisis, which at the time we hoped would stay in China, but also we had a financial crisis, which was going to impact the whole organization. So the thing I think that stood us in good stead was the practice we'd had with other crises, big and small. So when you have several hundred people that you need to move out of North Africa during the Arab Spring, then you have well-practiced processes by which you manage crises. So I think for me then, sort of what are the attributes? There's something about resilience, there's something about empathy for your staff, there's something about having practiced, you need to role play some of this stuff. And there's something also about just sheer resilience. I think, when I talk to, my colleagues and my staff, they're working harder and longer now than they have at any time.
And I suppose it's implicit in what you're saying about empathy for your staff. Communication is another huge skill that is necessary at this time from a leader.
Yeah, I think comms needs to be honest. It needs to be direct. We are in, have been in an existential financial crisis as well as a public health crisis. We have said that to our staff. We've said that on webinars, to thousands of members of our staff around the world. We've been open, we've been honest, we've been told them what the problems are. And because that's what helps people, first of all, know what's going on. And at a human level, then, out of respect to our staff, they have a right to know that there is an issue which will impact them potentially, because why would you hide it from them? It doesn't feel that would be consistent with our values, one of which happens to be the word integrity. The second one for me is the comms needs to be evidence-based. Put in the data. Don't say things are difficult. Everybody knows it's difficult, but share the data. Be honest about the data. Help people understand what the truth is. And people will internalize that in their own way, and they'll be able to do it in a way which helps them build their picture of reality, not just what you put out in comms. And the other one, I think, is there is something about visibility. I make sure that I do all our webinars, our town halls, as we call them, as well, making sure that there's a consistency in what we're saying, that it is accurate. I can help move the story on because people will be listening. This is the next episode in the saga as well. So I think you need to do that when you think you don't need to do it. So get out there early and start building the story, and as it evolves. So one of the ways this has proved helpful for us is we were communicating quite early about what was happening in China. Now, if you're in our office in Colombia, the pandemic took a long time to get to you, but you understood what it was about by the time it did get to you, in terms of the implications for you as an individual potentially, but also as an organization.
You're a nephew of one of Ireland's most treasured communicators, Mícheál Muirhearty. Do you think did you inherit any of his legendary communication skills?
I think he does have legendary communication skills, and I think the rest of us are pale shadows compared to Mícheál.
Right. Yes, yeah, and he's doing well through the pandemic.
He is doing well. He's at home, yeah.
Okay, very good. And when you talked there about visibility, it strikes me a big buzzword in leadership, and more than a buzzword in recent years, has been authenticity. It seems that that's really important at this time. The really harsh spotlight of the pandemic shows up leaders with all their positive and negative traits in a very unforgiving way. You can't hide behind PR and spin and all the things that you might normally be able to work in your favor as a leader. Do you think, is that an issue around leadership in the context of a crisis like this one?
Well, I would argue that's about leadership in any situation. Because, if you are relying on spin to, communicate to your employees, they're bright, they understand that. So I think that authenticity, that transparency, that integrity is really important in all things. it comes into its own when times are difficult. But if you suddenly start being transparent when there's a crisis, people will see through that. Well, you haven't been that clear before. So how do I know this is true? So I think there's a lot in handling a crisis, which is about what you did before there was a crisis. Whether it is about leadership style, whether it is about practicing how to respond in a crisis. And if I can give you an example, we have what we call, we run what a bronze, silver, gold model of crisis management. So we have bronze teams, as they're called, in each country around the world. And they are handling the local crisis and the local issues. We have a silver team, which is global, which is working across countries, which makes sure that some of the things which were learned in how we handled the crisis in China are documented, put on the checklist, shared with the other countries. It's the integration layer. And then the third level is the corporate global layer, which is at this top level, which is saying, right, now what are the big strategic issues we're dealing with? And it's because we were able to spot the financial crisis developing along with the public health crisis in China, and we knew the implications that we just kicked that model in place very quickly. But we had practiced it. We had run simulations over the last couple of years, not about a pandemic as it happened to be about a gas explosion. The first time, second time was a terrorist attack. And we had practiced those things. So we had learned to work with each other and learned what the miscommunications were, and learned how the lack of coordination, what was it that caused that breakdown in communications. And then we were able to put processes in place to address those. So there's a lot, I think, in how you handle crisis, which is about what you've done beforehand, because then you don't make those mistakes for the first time. You might make other mistakes, but you don't make those ones.
And even though the crisis now is of a scale that none of us would ever have come across before or even contemplated we would be dealing with at this time, that playbook still stood you in good stead.
It did. We've adapted it because you can do that. But we first triggered the gold crisis, the existential top level crisis at the end of January. And we've been doing that ever since. So every morning, at some stage, including weekends, but not now, at 8:15, there is a meeting. We all get together and you say, right, what's happening? What are you doing? Are those people out of that country? What are we doing about, if you're watching the BBC today, you'll see that we were given a loan by the Treasury, which will, help us over the next while. So, we were keeping that mechanism going. And even if the meeting was 10 minutes and said, right, nothing happened today, that discipline is in place. And it works. And I think it's necessary, but you can't make that up on the hoof. Okay. If you try to do that, it'll just be difficult.
And another thing that strikes me about this crisis, and I guess all crises, is that there are different phases of the crisis. Okay, there's the immediate response, there's the kind of slogging your way through it, and then there's the recovery, which of course might have lasted for a very, very long time. Is there a playbook for these different stages of a crisis, and do you need the same type of leadership approach through all stages?
That's a good question. I think the paper, I think it's in the Harvard Business Review at the moment, which talks about, you've got the emergency phase, then you've got regression, when we all get bored and we all get snarky at each other and we start saying, well, is this going to work? I'm going to give up. And then there's the bit where you kind of begin to see that there is a future and there will be a way of working through it. I think my personal hypothesis is that if you're going to be an authentic leader, then you move through the phases just being the authentic leader. And if you start saying, right, now we need the alpha team to go in because we're in an emergency and we all need to kind of look as if we're being superheroes, and then we say, no, now we're in the planning phase, it kind of doesn't work for me. I think it's more about being consistent, being agile, It probably challenges some of the ways we work, because we had to work extremely quickly to to get people out of countries before the airlines closed down and before the health system came under pressure. So you have to be agile, but I don't think the style of leadership per se changes as you go through, because actually, if you're really managing a crisis, you're doing all those at the same time anyway. And so you can't say, right now we're in emergency mode and, oh no, now we'll start planning about the recovery. Actually, you're planning for the recovery while you're entering the emergency. Mm-hmm. And you have to find a way of doing both. And you might have different teams focusing on different aspects, but you can't just, it's not neatly sequential. And the pandemic is a great example. China was coming out of the depths of the crisis long before Colombia entered it.
And of course, in terms of coming out from this crisis, there is such a degree of uncertainty as to what is ahead of us. We can't say with any degree of security that this is behind us now. There could be a massive second wave about to descend on us later in the year, or the thing through mutation or good public health management or a vaccine, the thing could actually be behind us. So how can a leader lead in a situation of such uncertainty?
I think you have to go back to scenario planning, I think. So, in steady state, and I'm sure you do it as a university, how many students will be there next year? Well, it'll be pretty similar to the number of students in UCD this year, and it might be a bit up and it might be a bit down, and there might be a bit more engineering, and it might be a bit less of something else. But in this world where we genuinely don't know what will happen, then all you can do is say, right, we'll have 3 or 4 different plans going. We'll go for the kind of, it all comes back and it's all going to be marvelous in 6 months. We'll have actually it's only going to come back to 50%, and then we'll have it's going to continue to be terrible one. And then you start saying, now, how am I going to recognize which of the scenarios is playing out? And then you watch for those triggers. And then you begin to say, well, actually, I think I'm a bit more confident it's heading this way. But you can't say we're going to have a central planning assumption and then it'll be a bit more, it'll be a bit less. You have to say we have different scenarios, and we'll try and recognize which one we're in as quickly and elegantly as possible.
So it's that idea of being able to quickly recognize where you are and where you're headed and respond with confidence, with authenticity, and bring your people with you. So there's a degree of vision as well required as we all seek to look to a new and different and improved horizon. You need somebody who can see where we might go.
Yeah, Charles Handy, who's an Irish and a management guru, tells a tale which I've no doubt he made up, which is that he was traveling through Wicklow, and that he said, how do you get to wherever it was? And said, well, drive down there and 1 mile before the pub, turn up to the right. But what he was saying was that that's kind of what you have to try and do, is to anticipate the possible futures and do some planning around those. So one of the best ways, if I've talked about planning your crisis management and practicing your crisis management, but the other thing that works, and back in the chemical industry, we would do this a lot, but we do it in all organizations, and we do it as the British Council, is to have a risk register, saying what are the things could possibly go wrong. And you say, right, now how will I recognize that? How will I mitigate that? So you try and say, it might never happen, it probably won't happen, but just in case it does, we're going to have this in place. And funnily enough, one of the things that was on our risk register was a recognition of our dependence on our partnerships with China. And so now we didn't know what might disrupt those partnerships. Yeah. We didn't know if it would be a pandemic or something else, but it was there. So we had a kind of a view that if something happens in China, it's really serious. If it's going to be mitigated, we're going to have to do these kinds of things. So we were watching for issues, which might originate in, for us, which was our biggest global partnership. And so we were trying to sort of see something before it happened and divert it. And of course, given something of the nature of the pandemic, it's much bigger than we had ever anticipated. But the advantage was at least we were looking for it.
And how do you think, because the corporate world, risk registers have been a part of the corporate world for quite a while now, corporate governance in all organizations of significant scale, how do you think the body, corporate or institutions more generally, have responded in this case? Have risk registers worked? Have people been able to adapt in an agile fashion to this unprecedented situation?
I suspect the answer to that is mostly yes. And I think we've all surprised ourselves by that. If I think of some of my colleagues in other organizations, I don't think any of us really had understood what a pandemic of this nature could do. Probably entirely detached from our corporate lives or work lives. We'd seen movies and we'd read the occasional thing about the 1918 flu or whatever it was. But I suspect that most organizations in their risk management, I would say, we knew what we would do with China. We never really said, what happens if the entire planet shuts down. But fortunately, what we had done was we had practiced remote working. And we were able to say, we're pretty confident we can run this organization, remotely. And now, even 18 months ago, we wouldn't have been able to do that. So I think there is something around the state of IT and technology, which means that the responsiveness was much better now than it would have been not very many years ago at all. Look what we're doing now. That wouldn't have been possible. So all these Teams calls, Zoom calls, Google Hangouts that we're all on from morning till night, how would we be running these organizations without that capability? And then we have to recognize there are many organizations in many parts of the world which are running the crisis without that capability. So how do we support them? And how do we support, we're fortunate, being, in the types of institutions we're in, that we have that capability, but there are many organizations which don't.
And that's a very good point about the pandemic more broadly. We're viewing it from the perspective, the comfortable perspective here in Western Europe, where it is a desperately difficult situation, but we have many advantages that we can apply to mitigate it for us. Yeah. Countries around the world are facing up to much more difficult situations, and you see that through your work with the British Council.
Yeah, and I think we, you see the whole spectrum. We see health systems which are coping admirably. We see health systems which were under huge pressure anyway, where many people didn't have access, and are being challenged. We've been talking to a number of colleagues around the network who are living in cities with very high levels of poverty and real abject poverty, and trying to say, well, what can we do to make sure that our employees who don't get to sit in a nice room like this and work from a desk, but are still trying to do their jobs, sitting on a floor, sharing a very small house in 2 hours away from where they would normally be, how do we support them in that? And I think Ireland has had a sort of a relatively well-managed and good campaign in the pandemic, but let's feel for the people who very tragically died in that, but let's also feel for the people who very tragically died in other countries. The one employee of ours who died was in Bangladesh, and it was a very, very difficult situation.
Yes. And another comment of the global response that has been much commented on is that countries with women leaders, and I have to ask you this one, people have been drawing a connection between the fact that those countries seem to be faring somewhat better than those with male leaders. We know all the limitations of these small samples and so on. If you look at New Zealand, Germany, Denmark, Finland, a number of them with women leaders do seem to have done well. What do you think?
Oh, I'm sure you're entirely right. And I think in part that's true, because I think what would really represent, because of course there are other countries, you know, who we would love to believe we're in a world where it is 50-50. But I think it's possibly a testament to societies which are open to diversity in that sense, and who are very inclusive, have a bigger pool of people to select from, and therefore they are more likely to, you know, vote for people who are on the margin, better people from a better pool. Perhaps it's an interesting speculation. So for me, what I would say is, if you think of organizations which have a diverse leadership are more likely, I think, to have diversity of thought, diversity of experience, diversity of skills that you can bring to a problem. So I'm sure there'll be a PhD in that for somebody, but my hypothesis is diversity is a good thing, and therefore we shouldn't be surprised.
And getting back to one of your earlier points about empathy, the pandemic is hitting people at such a personal level, and issues of childcare or other caring responsibilities are, so germane to how people are able to deal with the situation, that to have a diversity of leadership that understands these varying experiences, as you say, can only improve a response. Another question before, and we'll shortly turn over to the Q&A, so please, any of you who have questions, put them in on the Q&A module at the bottom of the screen. Another question that I'll put to you concerns the climate crisis, which very much hasn't gone away. It's another crisis that we are living through. It operates at a very different timescale. Certainly the feedback loops are very, very different. So the way that the world has mobilized in response to the immediacy of the pandemic is not matched by the way the world is mobilizing in response to the climate crisis. So how does leadership balance or manage a crisis like that, where the impacts of behavioral change are not as immediate as they are in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic?
I think this is a real challenge. I mean, there are other big global problems. There's what's happening at the moment about following the racist events in to the west of us. I think there are injustices and problems in society which were there before the pandemic, and they'll be there after the pandemic. And I think we really need to worry about them. I think there is something for me around, and if there's any good to come out of this pandemic, telling us that things you kind of intellectually know might happen, but you kind of also say, well, of course they won't happen, and they certainly won't happen on my watch, might happen on your watch. And I think if we can find a way of translating that lesson into things like climate change and say, look, we can all magically hope that this won't be a problem for the next 50 years, and that we won't be around to see the consequences. But actually, we have a duty, but also who says it's going to be 50 years? It might be 5. So what are we going to do now? So I'm hoping that what we see in the next generation of young people coming up, who we tend to work with around the world, is a much stronger sense of cohesion around some of those big shared global challenges, and an expectation that they have, not only of their governments, but even of their employers, that they will be part of the solution, not part of the problem. So I think if we can find ways to encourage that to be taken seriously, and to encourage our young people to participate in politics or civil society or social action, whatever it is, and have a much more engaged cohort, as Greta famously has done, I think then we have a better chance. If I have 2 worries about the pandemic, one is we're only at the beginning of the economic consequences of this, and we have to worry about the people who will be less fortunate, more damaged by this. And the second one is that economic consequence might crowd out things like climate change, social justice as well. And so I think we have to watch it, and we have to say that if we're going to have to suffer the financial consequences and the social consequences and the tragic loss of life that we have, then let's make sure at least we make the world a better place because of it, because otherwise it's just going to happen again, or something's going to happen again.
And there's also the intergenerational consequences of the pandemic. A lot of the burden is falling on younger generations, including children, who of course are the least affected by the disease itself, but might bear much of certainly the disruption of the pandemic in terms of education, and many of the economic consequences for those who are in the earlier stages of their careers. It's a big possibility for intergenerational divide there, perhaps.
Yeah, and I think we need to be acutely aware of that, and you can see that in various countries around the world, that the economic consequences, the job losses, will be the group in the middle. The highest proportion of the mortality and health consequences will be in an older cohort, and the people who will have their education disrupted and their plans disrupted will be the younger cohort. So this really is something which is impacting the whole of humanity. Yes.
Now let's see the questions coming in. Here's a nice one for you. How do you stay motivated and positive during this period?
It's a really, really important topic. The well-being of people who are, whether it's me, this is week 11, I think, in the house, but what about other members of staff as well? What we try and do is, first of all, encourage our staff to make sure that there is some social interaction, available, organised, and that they check up on colleagues who might be on maternity leave, and who might otherwise sort of not have people checking in on them as well. So I think we actively have to make sure we support people to have some social contact. We get some of it, on Zoom or whatever through work, some of it on Zoom with families, but actually taking some time to have, and the China team, go back to them, that we learned so much from. They were having sort of, tea and cake, and they would say, right, the next Zoom call isn't going to be about work, it's going to be about tea and cake. Let's all take an hour to stop. So building some of that in. The other one is, I think, as human beings, we are resilient in a crisis, by and large. We have to do things which reinforce that, support people to be resilient as well, because it is hard on many people, and when you're in a kind of a deep financial crisis, and you've got public health worries, and you've got everything else that normally goes on as well. I think we support each other in that, and it's the only way, because if you try and kind of carry it all yourself, it's hard on people, and I would say it's hard on as an individual as well.
Yeah. Here's a very interesting question from Lusaka. How can we harness the world's energy dealing with COVID-19 to deal more adequately with malaria, which is a far bigger killer globally, but mostly in the southern hemisphere?
Yeah, I think public health will be very different at the end of this. I think, while there is a lot of progress being made in some of the big public health topics, I think organizations like the WHO will come out of this stronger. I know other people think it might be damaged by it. I don't. I think come out stronger. I think we will recognize the advantage of early action on some of the things which we were kind of just managing previously as society. And I think there will be one of the important things which isn't really talked about a lot is the level of global collaboration on trying to find the vaccines and the treatments. And I think there will be partnerships developed Gavi writ large, which will stand us in good stead for other things. It's back to, if some good is going to come out of all of this, why wouldn't we preserve some of those important things and apply them to other things like malaria?
And a somewhat related question here about the good that might come out of this. We've got somebody giving the example of air pollution. There are people who found that they're not using their inhaler at all during this lockdown. Is there any way we could continue the benefits while still ending the lockdown?
Yeah, I think we see it in some cities, and I know it's happening in Dublin, it's happening here in London as well, and I'm sure elsewhere where local authorities are taking the opportunity to pedestrianise, to try and encourage that, and to encourage more walking, cycling, wherever. I would love to believe that is true. We do see that. If you look at industry in China, industry is ramping back up. So activity will come back up. People are beginning to drive again, but it isn't going back to the same level as it was. So there will be some improvement in the environmental impact, but it needs to be a lot more. I think, and my worry, as I say, is that there's a danger that the financial recovery will crowd out some of these important topics.
A couple of questions on our response in Ireland. Now, you won't want to get into too much detail, I'm sure, about commenting on the nature of our response, but is there anything that has struck you at a high level of how society has responded?
I think the first thing to say is, the public have been fantastic. I think the reason that the number of cases, started falling when it did was because of the solidarity of, the public and the support of the public for the public health messages which they were being asked to follow. And you can compare that response and the outcome with some other places, and you'll see a good thing. The second high level one is the brilliance and the flexibility and the innovation shown by the staff of the HSE, the staff of other partners that we work with as well, and innovating very, very quickly to make sure that the many thousands of people who did get the virus had the best possible treatment, and it didn't overwhelm the system, and that people got the best possible care. And the tragedy of the 1,650 or so people who have died, we mustn't forget that. And we must say, each of those is a tragedy. It's a personal tragedy. It's a family tragedy. It's a tragedy for society as well. But the two overriding things for me was the clarity of the public health messages. I think they were clear. They were well communicated by many parties, and the public response and the innovation, which the care system in its widest sense, and I think we as a society should be quite proud of that. It's not to say that everything was always perfect, but it was a good thing to see. Yeah.
I'll take one more question, and again, apologies to those whose questions we're not able to get to. How can leaders safeguard positive elements of their organization's culture, which have been negatively impacted by the rapid transition to a virtual or non-traditional work environment? So how organizations have such well embedded cultures that are so important to who they are and how they do as an organization. The fact that we've all been turned head over heels now in terms of the way in which we work. How can we keep the positive aspects of the work culture going?
I think when we get back to being able to go into the office or the laboratory or the shop or whatever it is, that we will be hungry for that kind of social interaction as well, and that cultural thing that we get from unity, that we get from being part of a an organization or a club or a team, however one wants to describe it. And I do think we need to not get over enthusiastic about the joys of not commuting and remote working for exactly that reason, for the that kind of social thing. And I was on a similar call with run by The Economist magazine a couple of weeks ago, where there were a group of us and we were talking about this issue about what will it be like to go back, and the most powerful intervention for me was somebody saying, well, remember that particularly for young people, that the networks that they build, the relationships they build, the friendships they build through work and after work are a huge part of not only what their kind of social life, but also of what builds the those networks which they have 5 years, 10 years, 15 years later. So if we were to force, this was an organization with people in 100 and something countries, just like the one I work for, they were saying, if we deny young people that, we're not just denying them a social environment and a good environment to work in, and and by the way, remember that I'm able to work in this room, but if you're in a flat share with 5 other people, all of whom think that the living room is where they're going to work, it's not the same. And equally, you're depriving them of that network building, which is part of what makes them effective 5 years, 10 years, 15 years later. So I think this thing around saying what are the positive attributes of the culture of work that we used to have, which are different to the ones that we're operating in, at least for the moment. If we don't understand what they are, we might damage them. And it won't be people like the chief executive who are damaged by it. It'll be the graduate entrant or the mid-career manager or whoever who will be damaged by it. So I think we need to think about this really seriously and make sure that we don't get over enthusiastic about the joys of remote working.
And we're so conscious of that in the universities as well, as of course you will know. For so long we've been hearing about this move to online learning, it'll all be online in the future. We are seeing now how desperately students want and need that campus experience where they get to engage with one another. And as you say, build those links that will stand them in good stead over their careers, their personal lives. We all benefited from that. And we are desperate to see current generations of students benefit from that once again. And maybe that allows me to ask you one final question. When you were back in Merrion Street, you would never have imagined that your career would see you lead the British Council through a worldwide pandemic, oversee the Health Service Executive. How can we prepare our students now for the extraordinary and diverse challenges that they are going to face over the course of their careers when we know nothing about what those crises might look like?
I'm sure the curriculum is very different now to when I went through chemical engineering, but I think there is something about, even in a very technical subject like engineering, that educating people for the human factors which are involved in running organizations or in running any response to whether it's a crisis or it's problem solving as well, because I think that those human skills are partly what allow you to be very effective in a technical environment, and I'm sure there are ways to do it to work those into a curriculum which are legitimate for the content of the curriculum as well. And I remember listening to a talk on the Piper Alpha explosion, which some people might remember, which was when a North Sea oil rig exploded and killed, I think, 176 people. Now, it wasn't the chemical engineering equations that blew the place up. It was the human factors. So for me, building into university curricula something around how does this topic which we're studying, how does that work in the human system, which is society, when you go out into that world, feels like a topic for me, which I know as a young engineer, I would have benefited from, rather than picking it up X years later in the tragic circumstances of a of an industrial explosion. So for me, there's something around making sure that we teach how things should be done from a kind of a human point of view, as well as what should be done. And if we can get that right, I think we will help with this kind of whole system education. And I think it is part of the strength of the Irish education system. It may not necessarily have been on the curriculum in Merrion Street, but what was in Merrion Street was the debating society, all the other clubs and things, which are as legitimate a part of a university education as the classroom, because it's in making your contribution to the committee of whatever society you're interested in, or being part of the squash club or whatever it is, which allows you to pick up some of those other skills. And I think for me, if you add those to some of the attributes of being in an Irish society anyway, which is very oral, we like talking to each other, we are always interested in who the other person is, those are skills which are then applicable in subsequent careers.
And we've always been aware of that in UCD. We always try to bring out those qualities in our graduates. And thank you for reminding us of that, Ciarán, and we will endeavour to continue to do so in these current very difficult circumstances. Thank you very much for your time this evening. Thank you for being a great friend to us in UCD and being such a wonderful example to our alumni. Thanks to all our alumni who've joined us here this evening, and thanks to Jenna and the team in UCD Alumni Office who have organised it. We see UCD alumni, the length and breadth of the response to the pandemic in the public health response, people like Mike Ryan and Tony Houlihan leading internationally and nationally, all the frontline staff, all those involved in keeping economy and society ticking over at this time, all the scientists and researchers who are doing their best to help us extract ourselves from the current situation. So I'll now hand over to Jenna to say goodnight to us.
Yes, a big thank you from all of us in UCD Alumni Relations to Ciarán Devane and Professor Orla for sharing their time with us. And a thank you to all of you as well for your questions and for tuning in. We'd be delighted to hear your suggestions for future conversations. Simply email alumni@ucd.ie. And we will be back next week on Thursday, June 18th with Dr. Cara Augustenborg, environmental scientist, climate change champion, broadcaster, and environmental policy and teaching fellow at the UCD School of Architecture, Planning, and Environmental Policy. Cara will appear in conversation with UCD Engineering and Economics alumna, Dr. Lisa Ryan, assistant professor and lecturer in energy economics at the UCD School of Economics. And you are also very welcome to join us for a lunchtime webinar series entitled What It Takes, which has been created for UCD students, staff, and alumni looking to start, boost, or pivot their careers during these unprecedented times. We will put this link in the chat box as well. So again, thank you so much for being with us this evening, and we look forward to welcoming you again next week. Please stay safe and well. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.